The snow fell in thick, silent sheets across the barren land of Montana, blanketing the world in a deathly quiet that made even the wind hold its breath. White swallowed brown earth, ice-covered rot, and at the edge of a frost-bitten cattle yard, a young woman stood shackled to a wagon like livestock bound for slaughter. Her name was June, 22 years old, with a belly round with life and lips cracked from cold. The iron shackles around her wrists had worn raw patches into her skin, and every breath came out in small white puffs that disappeared into the gray afternoon sky. Her brother stood a few feet away, haggling with a rancher who reeked of whiskey and cruelty, his voice carrying across the frozen ground like the caw of a hungry crow. "She's healthy," her brother said, voice dry as autumn leaves. "Strong legs, doesn't talk much. 7 months along, but the baby will come clean." The rancher looked her up and down with dead eyes, examining her like a man might examine a horse he was considering buying. His gaze lingered on her swollen belly, calculating value, measuring worth. "And she won't run?" "She won't," her brother grinned, his teeth stained yellow from tobacco. "Not anymore." That was when it happened. A sudden, sharp kick from inside her belly, not the usual gentle flutters she had grown accustomed to, not the slow rolls of a growing child turning in sleep. No, this was a jolt, powerful and urgent, like a fist knocking from the inside out, demanding attention, demanding action. June's breath caught in her throat. Her spine stiffened as another kick followed, then another. It wasn't pain she felt, but something deeper, a demand, a plea, a desperate message from the child who shared her blood and her fate. She closed her eyes against the biting wind and whispered under her breath, words meant only for the life growing within her. "I hear you, baby. I hear you, and I swear on my soul, I won't let them sell you too." Snow clung to her dark lashes like tears she refused to shed. Wind burned her cheeks until they felt raw and numb. The wagon creaked under its own weight as the rancher prepared to load her up and haul her back to his land like another piece of property. Chains scraped against wood as rough hands yanked her toward the rear of the wagon. Her brother didn't look back, not even once. The gold coins gleamed in his palm, cold metal that had bought his sister's freedom and sold his soul in the same transaction. He counted each piece with the care of a man who had never learned the value of anything that couldn't be weighed or measured. June waited, heart hammering against her ribs, feeling the child inside her grow restless. She waited until the wagon wheel hit a deep rut in the frozen ground, just enough of a jolt to shift everyone's balance, just enough of a distraction to give her the single moment she needed. Then June moved with the desperate strength of a mother, protecting her young. She twisted hard, slamming her shoulder into the man beside her with every ounce of force her weakened body could muster. The chain connecting her shackles caught against the wagon rail and cracked with a sound like breaking bone. The rancher cursed loud enough to wake the dead, stumbling backward as she rolled off the wagon bed. Her feet hit the snow and her knees buckled immediately, but she was up before they could even shout her name, running with the awkward, determined gait of a woman carrying precious cargo. Behind her, men hollered and boots crunched through snow, but she didn't stop, didn't look back, didn't hesitate. Branches slapped her face and drew thin lines of blood. Ice sliced through her thin coat and bitted her skin. The world became a blur of gray sky and white ground, punctuated by the high-pitched ringing of pure terror in her ears. Her breath tore through her throat like broken glass, and bright drops of blood dotted the snow behind her like breadcrumbs marking her desperate path. Her boots were soaked through, her coat too thin for the brutal cold, her body fragile from months of poor treatment and little food. But she ran because inside her was someone else, someone who depended on her completely, someone who wasn't for sale at any price. She could feel it, the heartbeat that wasn't hers, pounding alongside, her own like twin drums, beating out a rhythm of survival. The baby didn't cry, couldn't cry yet, but she felt its presence pushing through her fear like sunlight breaking through storm clouds. Run, Mama, run. So she did, crashing through pine trees older than memory, past crows who didn't bother to scatter, over ridges where no human foot had touched the snow that winter. Her lungs burned like fire, her knees screamed in protest, but her arms clutched her belly like a shield, protecting the most precious treasure in the world. No one had ever protected her before. Not her father, long dead from drinking himself into an early grave. Not her mother, buried alongside her own broken dreams and unfulfilled promises. And certainly not her brother, who had just traded her body and her child's future for enough gold to keep him drunk through the winter. But she could protect this child, even if it killed her. Even if her heart burst from the effort. Even if her lungs gave out. Even if she collapsed in the snow and never rose again. She would die free, and her baby would be born free, and that would have to be enough. Twilight crept across the sky. Like spilled ink, and the snow deepened with each step. The wind howled low and long like a wolf hunting alone in the darkness. Her pace slowed as exhaustion began to claim her. Her vision blurred from cold and fear, and her fingers lost all feeling inside her thin gloves. Still, she pressed on, one foot in front of the other, because stopping meant capture, and capture meant chains, and chains meant her child would be born into the same slavery that had defined her own short, bitter life. Then her foot slipped on a patch of hidden ice, and she tumbled down a short ravine, landing hard on her side in a snowdrift so deep it swallowed half her body. The impact knocked all the air from her lungs and left her gasping, fighting to draw breath into her shocked system. For a long, terrifying moment, she couldn't move, couldn't think, couldn't do anything but lie there and wait for death or capture. Whichever found her first. Then came another kick, softer this time, not urgent or afraid, just present, just there, just alive. I'm here, she whispered through blue lips, and a voice cracked from cold and exhaustion. We're still here. Part 2. The light in the woods. Thomas paused mid-swing, his weathered axe frozen halfway through a thick log of Montana pine. Years of solitude in these deep woods had sharpened his senses beyond the need for human conversation, and something in the evening air felt different, wrong somehow. The wind carried more than just the scent of snow and pine needles. It carried the ragged sound of labored breathing, and something softer beneath it, something that made the hair on his arms stand up despite his thick flannel shirt. He sat down, the axe with deliberate care, and tilted his head, listening with the patience of a man who had learned that silence often spoke louder than words. The sound came again, faint but unmistakable human breathing, desperate and shallow, punctuated by small whimpers of pain or fear. Without hesitation, Thomas slipped through the tree line, his heavy boots moving with surprising quiet over the snow-covered ground. A lifetime of hunting had taught him to move like a shadow when necessary, and right now, every instinct told him that stealth might mean the difference between life and death for whoever was out there in his woods. He followed the broken branches and the whisper of blood, drops on pristine snow, signs that told a story he'd seen before but had hoped never to see again. Not animal tracks, but human ones, and recent. The trail led him deeper into the forest, away from his cabin and toward the old ravine where he sometimes went to think about things. Better left buried. Then he saw her. She was crumpled in the snow like a broken bird, one hand curled protectively over her swollen belly, the other stretched out as if reaching for something just beyond her grasp. Her dark hair was matted with ice and blood. Her lips had turned the pale blue of hypothermia, and snow was already beginning to accumulate on her still form. But what struck him most was the way she held herself, even unconscious, like she was shielding something precious from a cruel world. The child within her was obvious even through her torn coat. 7 months along, maybe 8, and still growing despite whatever hell she'd been through to end up here. Her body was curled in an impossible position, as if she could protect the unborn baby with nothing but fierce maternal will. Her eyes fluttered open as he approached, unfocused and glassy with cold, but her mouth formed a single word that cut through him like a blade. "Help!" Thomas crouched beside her and studied the scene with the careful attention of a man who had learned not to trust coincidence. Fresh tracks in the snow told him she hadn't come here, along multiple sets of heavy boot prints, the kind made by men with weight and weapons, possibly horses somewhere nearby waiting for orders. They would come looking, and soon. He stood and scanned the surrounding trees, his jaw setting grim determination. Time was running short, and every second he delayed might mean the difference between salvation and capture for this unknown woman and her child. But Thomas had spent years in these woods, and he knew how to make them work in his favor. Moving with practiced efficiency, he grabbed fallen pine branches and dragged them behind him to sweep over the blood trail she'd left. He kicked fresh snow across every footprint, looping the path in wide circles to confuse any tracking attempts. In the brush behind where she lay, he quickly set up a snare trap, not for animals this time, but for men. If they followed her this far, they would limp away with more than just wounded pride. When he returned to her side, she had stopped shivering entirely, and Thomas knew what that meant. The cold was winning, shutting down her body's defenses one by one. He sighed heavily through his nose, his breath forming white clouds in the frigid air. "Damn fool woman," he muttered under his breath, but there was no anger in his voice, only resignation tinged with something that might have been compassion. "Freezing to death out here with a baby. What kind of world leaves someone like you to die alone?" Without another word, he bent down and lifted her into his arms. She was too light for someone so far along, and her breathing came in soft, barely perceptible whispers against his chest. He adjusted her weight carefully, making sure not to jostle her belly, then began the half-mile trek back to his cabin through snow that was falling harder now, as if the sky itself was trying to erase all evidence of what had happened here tonight. His cabin sat hidden in a thick grove of evergreens, its low profile and weathered walls blending so perfectly with the landscape that a person could walk within 50 feet of it and never know it was there. No smoke rose from its stone chimney. Thomas burned fires only when absolutely necessary, and he hadn't expected to need one again this week. Tonight, that would change. He kicked the heavy wooden door open with one boot, careful not to jar his unconscious burden, and carried her inside to the narrow cot beside his old iron stove. The room smelled of pine tar, wool, and the honest scent of a man who lived simply but cleanly. Every item in the small space had a purpose, and nothing was wasted or ornamental. Thomas moved without pause or hesitation. He stoked the banked embers in his stove and fed them fresh logs until flames began to lick hungrily at the dry wood. Warmth crawled across the floor like a living thing, filling corners that had been cold for days. He pulled off her soaked boots and set them near the hearth to dry, then wrapped a thick bearskin around her legs and torso. Her hands were like ice, the fingers white and stiff with cold. He tucked them carefully beneath the fur blanket, checking for signs of frostbite, relieved to find none. Color was already beginning to return to her face as the heat from the stove worked its magic, and her breathing grew deeper and more regular. Only then did he allow himself to speak, his voice rough from disuse but oddly gentle. "I don't take." "In strays," he said, half to himself and half to the unconscious woman. "Don't make a habit of helping folks. But dying in my woods, that would be a waste of good snow." He settled into his only chair and watched as life slowly returned to her features. Her breathing steadied. The terrible blue tinge left her lips, and something like peace settled over her face as warmth drove away the specter of death. The furrow of pain between her brows smoothed out, and for the first time, he could see that. She was younger than he'd first thought, probably barely out of her teens, with the kind of face that spoke of innocence lost too soon. Thomas stared at the dancing flames in his stove, orange and gold light licking the black iron belly like eager tongues. The fire reminded him of another night, years ago now, when different flames had danced in different circumstances. He remembered the acrid smell of smoke, the terrible heat, and his daughter's small fingers slipping from his grasp as burning timber collapsed between them. He hadn't lit a fire for another person since that night. Now here he was, stoking flames. For a stranger, for a woman whose name he didn't know and whose story he could only guess at. He reached for his dented kettle, filled it with clean snow from outside, and set it on the stove to melt into drinking water. The simple act of preparation, of caring for another human being, felt both foreign and achingly familiar. Outside, the wind howled like something ancient and unforgiving, battering the walls of his small sanctuary with icy fists. But inside, the cabin pulsed with warmth, not just heat from the fire, but something deeper, more dangerous. A warmth he had forgotten how to feel. The warmth that came from having someone to protect. The woman slept on, her lips lightly parted, hair damp with melted ice but no longer frozen. Thomas said nothing more, but his eyes kept drifting to her belly, watching for the subtle movements that would tell him the child within still lived, not out of curiosity, but out of duty. Whatever she was running from had no place in his woods, and whatever came next, he would face it the way he faced everything, quietly, with axe in hand and fire at his back. For the first time in years, Thomas had lit a fire not just to survive. Another cold night, but to keep someone else alive. And that simple act, that moment of compassion in a world that had shown him precious little, changed everything. Part 3. Awakening to kindness, June woke to the gentle crackle of burning wood, and the clean scent of pine smoke curling through air that felt blessedly warm against her skin. For several heartbeats, she forgot where she was, forgot how she'd gotten here, forgot everything except the profound relief of being somewhere safe and dry. The world around her was still and quiet in a way she hadn't experienced in months not. The terrible silence of fear, but the peaceful quiet of sanctuary. She blinked slowly, her head resting on a pillow stuffed with straw and old wool that smelled faintly of lavender. Her fingers curled around a heavy blanket that had been tucked carefully around her body, coarse homespun fabric that spoke of practical hands and simple living. As her vision cleared, she took in her surroundings with growing wonder. The cabin was small but well organized, every item placed with obvious intention and care. A low wooden shelf held tin mugs, a blackened kettle, and bundles of dried herbs tied with rough twine. Beside the iron stove sat a covered pot from which steam still rose, carrying the rich aroma of venison stew. A single candle flickered on a rough-hewn table, casting dancing shadows on walls made from logs chinked with mud and moss near the stone hearth. Tucked into a corner like a carefully kept secret, stood something that made her breath catch in. Her throat a wooden cradle, simple and old, but clearly hand-carved with loving attention to detail. It wasn't new. One leg had been mended with obvious care, but it had been positioned to catch the fire's warmth, its interior lined with a faded but clean quilt. June looked down at her own belly, still round and heavy beneath the borrowed shirt that hung loose on her small frame. The baby stirred as if sensing her attention, a gentle roll that brought tears to her eyes, tears of relief, of gratitude, of wonder that they had both survived the night. "We're safe," she whispered to her unborn child, her voice hoarse from cold and exhaustion. "We're finally safe." Evidence of her mysterious rescuer's thoughtfulness lay scattered around the small room like breadcrumbs leading her toward understanding. A wooden comb sat beside the candle, its teeth sanded smooth by careful hands. A leather strap hung by the door, clearly meant for her boots, which she could see drying near the hearth. and beside the pot of stew, a folded scrap of paper held a message written in rough, squared handwriting that made her smile despite everything she'd been through. Don't burn the stew, and don't lift anything heavy. Your belly's big as a grain barrel. The smile came unexpectedly, like warmth breaking through frost, the first real smile she'd worn in longer than she could remember. It felt strange on her face, unfamiliar but welcome, like putting on clothes that fit after months of wearing chains. Later that day, as pale winter sunlight filtered through the cabin's small windows, Thomas returned carrying 2 armloads of split firewood balanced on his broad shoulders. Snow clung to his dark beard and the shoulders of his patched coat, and his boots left puddles of melted ice on the wooden floor as he entered. He nodded at her without ceremony, acknowledging her consciousness with the same matter-of-fact acceptance. He might show the sunrise. You're up. That's good. I am, she replied, watching as he set the wood down by the stove with efficient movements. Every action seemed purposeful, nothing wasted, nothing done for show. His beard was thick and shot through with gray, his flannel shirt patched at both elbows, and his weathered hands moved with the confidence of a man who had learned to depend on no one but himself. I don't know how to thank you, June said quietly, meaning every word. You saved our lives. Thomas pulled off his wet gloves and hung them on a peg near the door. Don't. I mean it. I don't do things to be thanked. You needed heat. That's all there was to it. She nodded, understanding instinctively that this was a man who found gratitude uncomfortable, who preferred action to words. He moved to the stove and lifted the lid of the stew pot, sniffing the contents before adding a pinch more salt from a small cloth pouch. Eat while it's hot, he said, reaching for a wooden bowl from the shelf. When June started to rise for the heavier blue bowl, Thomas paused in his ladling. Not that one. The blue one's lighter, less to carry in your condition. June blinked in surprise. Even in this small detail, he had thought of her comfort, her limitations, her needs. You've thought of everything, haven't you? He grunted noncommittally, filling the lighter bowl with thick stew rich with meat and vegetables. Just common sense. She settled at the small wooden table, sipping slowly, letting the warmth fill her chest and belly like liquid comfort. Thomas didn't sit down to eat with her. Instead, he moved around the cabin with restless energy, checking window shutters, adjusting the damper on the stove. Always in motion, always working as her eyes wandered around the room, taking in more details now that she was fully alert. Something on the rough wooden mantelpiece caught her attention. A small carved frame sat there, uneven and delicate, clearly handmade with loving but inexpert hands. Inside, no photograph or painting, just a name etched in soft, looping script that spoke of feminine hands and careful attention. Ellie. June looked up at Thomas, who had frozen mid-step at her obvious interest in the frame. Several seconds. His jaw tensed and his hands clenched at his sides, and she could see him wrestling with memories that clearly caused him pain. Your daughter? She asked gently. His voice, when it came, was flat and carefully controlled. Yes, she was a long time ago. Where is she now? She's not here. Hasn't been for years. He turned away slightly, as if the frame on the mantel was too painful to look at directly. Fire took her. House didn't stand much longer after that. June's hand stilled on the wooden bowl, her heart clenching with sympathy for this gruff man who had saved her life and was now sharing his deepest grief with a stranger. I'm so sorry. He nodded once, a sharp jerk of his head. Me too. Moved by impulse and understanding, June rose carefully and walked to the cradle by the fire. She ran her hand along its smooth edge, feeling the careful workmanship, the love that had gone into every curve and joint. This was hers, she said softly. It wasn't a question. Yes. Silence stretched between them, not heavy or uncomfortable, but wide and deep, like a canyon where old grief still echoed. June placed both hands on her belly, feeling the baby move restlessly within. "I cry for mine too," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the crackling fire. "And she's not even born yet. I cry because I don't know how to protect her, how to keep her safe in a world that tried to buy and sell us both." Thomas turned away from the mantel, his face carefully composed, but his eyes betraying depths of understanding she hadn't expected. "I'm not good at saving people. Never was. You saved me." He shook his head firmly. "No, I just hate seeing folks freeze to death in my woods. Bad for the wildlife." But June heard something else in his voice, something softer beneath the gruff exterior. Before she could respond, he grabbed his heavy coat and headed for the door, pausing only long enough to add in a voice so low she almost missed it, "But I can keep someone warm. That I can still do." And then he was gone again, disappearing into the snow and leaving June alone with the fire, the cradle, and a growing understanding that she had found something more precious than shelter. She had found a man who understood loss, who knew what it meant to love something so deeply that its absence left wounds that never quite healed. For the first time in longer than she could remember, June didn't feel like she was waiting to be discarded or sold. She felt like she was home. Part 4. The weight of protection. The days that followed began to fold into each other with the comfortable rhythm of two people learning to share space without stepping on each other's needs or wounds. June discovered the cabin's small secrets and quirks, which floorboards creaked underfoot, which logs burned longest in the stove, how to coax medicinal tea from the jar of dried herbs Thomas kept on the highest shelf. Her body grew heavier with each passing day, the baby settling lower in preparation for birth. But the oppressive silence that had once frightened her in her brother's house now wrapped around her like protection. The quiet here felt different, not empty or threatening, but full of possibility, heavy with unspoken understanding between two people who had learned that safety was more precious than gold. Thomas moved through each day like a man only half tethered to the world, as if one foot remained planted in some other time, some other life where different choices had led to different endings. He didn't hover or fuss over her condition, but he noticed everything with the sharp attention of a man who had learned that small details could mean the difference between life and death. When her knife grew dull from cutting vegetables for their shared meals, she would find it sharp as a razor the next morning, lying beside the cutting board without comment or fanfare. When the old kettle developed a brown stain from repeated use, it appeared scrubbed clean with salt and vinegar, gleaming like new. When the leather hinge on the door began to groan with each opening, it was suddenly replaced before she even mentioned the annoying sound. But his words remained as sparse as winter grass, each one measured and practical. "Door won't slam shut on you now. Wind won't get through the crack. Don't leave the stew pot empty after cooking. Bears can smell food from miles off, and they're not particular about doors. Stop trying to thank me for every little thing. I don't like owing folks, and I don't like being owed either." June watched him from the corner of her eye, growing more curious with each passing day. Every kindness came wrapped in bark and thorns, every gentle gesture hidden beneath gruff practicality, as if he were afraid that showing too much softness might somehow diminish his strength. She tried once, over evening tea, to understand the man who had become her unlikely protector. "I'm not used to this," she said carefully, wrapping her hands around the warm tin mug. "People doing things for me without wanting something in return." Thomas replied without looking up from the boot he was resoling, his needle moving in steady practice strokes. "I'm not people." That night, the sky turned the color of old iron, and heavy clouds gathered like an army preparing for battle. Wind scraped against the cabin walls with increasing urgency, and June felt the baby roll low and restless in her belly, responding to changes in the weather with the ancient wisdom of the unborn. She was sitting in the wooden rocking chair near the hearth, darning a hole in the borrowed shawl Thomas had given her, when she heard something that made her blood freeze in her veins. A sound that didn't belong to the natural symphony of wind and snow, a steady rhythm of horse hooves approaching. Through the darkness, slow and deliberate, like predators stalking wounded prey. June's eyes shot to the small window, but she could see nothing beyond the glass except black trees and swirling snow. Her heart began hammering against her ribs with the frantic rhythm of a caged bird desperate for escape. Then Thomas was beside her without warning or sound, moving with the fluid silence of a man who had learned to be a shadow when necessary. He pulled her to her feet with gentle but firm hands and guided her quickly to the far end of the cabin, where he pressed his palm against what looked like a solid section of the back wall. To her amazement, the hidden panel opened to reveal a small crawl space beneath the lean-to pantry, just large enough for one person to hide comfortably. The space had been lined with old blankets and supplied with a water jug and dried meat, as if Thomas had prepared for this possibility long before she arrived. "Get in there," he said, his voice sharp with urgent command. "Take the blanket and stay low no matter what you hear. Don't come out until I tell you it's safe." June obeyed without question, her trust in this taciturn man absolute. She eased herself into the cramped space, pulling her knees up despite the awkward bulk of her pregnant belly, wrapping the heavy wool around her shoulders like armor. Thomas closed the panel just as the sound of hooves stopped outside their door. She couldn't see what happened next, but she could hear everything with terrible clarity. The cabin door opened, letting in a rush of cold air that made the fire flicker and dance. Heavy boots stomped snow off their solace and onto Thomas's clean wooden floor. "Evening," said a voice she didn't recognize, gruff and unfriendly. "Where?" "Looking for a girl. Pregnant, white, early 20s. Might have come through this way a few days back." Thomas's reply was steady and unimpressed. "You see any women around here?" "Can't say I do. But then, it's not like she'd be advertising her presence, would she? Girl's been causing trouble, running off from her rightful place. Her brother put up good money to get her back where she belongs. I live alone," Thomas said simply. "Have for years. That's the way I like it." A different voice joined the conversation, this one higher and more nervous. "We got reason to believe she headed this direction after she ran. We're being paid well to bring her back, and we don't intend to go home empty-handed." "Well then, you better keep looking," Thomas replied, and June could hear the dangerous edge creeping into his voice like winter wind. "Because she's not here, and I'm not much for social visits after dark." She heard boots moving across the floor, exploring, searching. Her breath came in short, silent gasps as she pressed herself deeper into the cramped hiding space, one hand protectively covering her belly. "You don't mind if we have a look around, do you?" the first voice asked, but it wasn't really a question. "Just to satisfy our curiosity. Actually, I do mind." Thomas's voice had gone flat and cold as January ice. "This is my home, and you weren't invited inside. Time for you to leave. Now hold on there, friend. No need to get unfriendly. We're just doing a job." June heard the soft scrape of metal against wood and knew without seeing that Thomas had picked up his axe from beside the door. When he spoke again, his voice carried the kind of quiet menace that came from a man who had nothing left to lose except the one small light he had sworn to protect. "I said she's not here, and if she was, I'd tell you the same damn thing. Now, get out of my home before I decide you're trespassing instead of just being stupid." Silence stretched like a held breath. Then, finally, the sound of retreating footsteps and the creak of leather as men mounted their horses. But before they rode away, the first voice called back through the darkness, "If you change your mind about being helpful, will be in the area for a few more days. Good money in it for anyone who can point us in the right direction." The horses moved away, but slowly, reluctantly, like wolves circling a campfire just beyond the reach of its light. Thomas waited a full 10 minutes before opening the hidden panel, his face grim with understanding of what this visit meant. "They're gone," he said quietly. "For now." June crawled out of the hiding space on shaking knees, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "They'll come back, won't they?" "Yes, and probably with more men next time." She looked up at him, seeing not just the gruff exterior, but the steel beneath, the quiet strength that had stood between her and the men who would drag her back to slavery. "What will we do?" Thomas moved to the window and peered out into the darkness, his jaw set with grim determination. "We leave before the next snowfall. I know someone who might help an old woman who lives near the river pass. She knows herbs and healing, and she owes me nothing, which means she won't lie to me or sell us out for bounty money." He began gathering supplies with swift efficiency. His hunting knife, coils of rope, extra blankets, and a leather pouch filled with dried meat and hardtack. Every movement spoke of a man who had learned to travel light and fast when necessary. "Why are you doing this?" June asked softly, watching him prepare to uproot the solitary life he had built in these woods. "Why are you willing to give up everything for a stranger and her child?" Thomas paused in his packing and looked at her for a long moment, his weathered face illuminated by the firelight. When he finally spoke, his voice was rough with emotion he rarely allowed himself to show. "Because I don't leave fires to burn out on their own when I can help it," he said simply. "And you, both of you, you're the brightest flame I've seen in years." He handed her a thick wool scarf and a pair of fur-lined mittens. "Wrap up warm. We ride before dawn, and it's going to be a long, cold journey to safety." As June took the offered clothes, she understood that the walls of the cabin that had once seemed so solid, so protective, had become too small to contain what was growing between them. The fire Thomas had lit that first night when he found her dying in the snow hadn't burned down or gone out. It had simply learned to move. Part 5. The Flight to Sanctuary. Before the first pale fingers of dawn could creep through the forest canopy, Thomas was already moving through the cabin with the quiet efficiency of a man who had learned that survival often depended on speed and silence. No sound escaped him except the soft thud of supplies being packed into canvas bags, the careful clink of his tin pot being wrapped in cloth, and the barely audible creak of floorboards beneath his worn boots. June stirred from the restless sleep that had claimed her despite the fear gnawing at her thoughts. She clutched her belly as another wave of pressure rolled through her lower back, stronger than the gentle movements she had grown accustomed to over the past few days. The baby seemed to sense the tension in the air, responding with restless kicks and turns that made her wince. "What's happening?" she whispered, struggling to sit up on the narrow cot. Thomas didn't pause in his preparations as he answered, but his voice carried an urgency that made her pulse quicken. "We're leaving now. Those men will be back with reinforcements, more questions and less patience. They know you're in the area, and they won't give up until they find you." June tried to rise from the bed, but faltered as the weight of her pregnancy made her movements clumsy and uncertain. Her hand pressed against the small of her back where a dull ache had been building throughout the night. "I can't move fast like this." "I'll only slow you down." Thomas glanced at her then, really looked at her, and she saw something flicker across his weathered features, not impatience or frustration, but a fierce protectiveness that took her breath away. "Then I'll move fast enough for both of us," he said simply. Without another word of explanation, he scooped her up in his arms as easily as if she weighed no more than a child, wrapping her carefully in the thick, bare fur from her bed. She started to protest, but he silenced her with a look that brooked no argument. "Save your strength," he said. carrying her toward the door. "You're going to need it for what comes next." He had already prepared the wagon outside, hitching his sturdy draft horse to the traces with hands that moved like they had done this 100 times before. In the wagon bed, he had laid out a nest of straw and blankets, creating a makeshift bed that would cushion her from the worst jolts and bumps of the rough mountain roads. Thomas placed her gently on the straw mattress, then secured the canvas cover over the wagon bed like he was wrapping something precious that the world had no right to touch or harm. The space was warm and dark, insulated from the bitter wind that cut through the pre-dawn air like a blade made of ice and malice. The wagon began to roll through the forest, wheels muffled by the thick snow that had fallen during the night. They moved in complete silence, except for the soft crunch of hooves and the occasional creak of leather harness. June lay in the straw, one hand pressed protectively over her belly, feeling the baby respond to the rocking motion with what seemed like approval. Through a small gap in the canvas, she caught glimpses of the world passing by frozen pine trees, standing like silent sentinels, ice-coated branches that sparkled in the dim light, and Thomas's broad back as he guided the horse, with steady hands and watchful eyes. His posture spoke of a man ready for trouble, shoulders tense, head turning constantly to scan the forest for signs of pursuit. At one point, when the silence became too heavy to bear, June found her voice and asked the question that had been burning in her chest since they left the cabin. "Where are we going?" Thomas's reply came without turning around, his voice barely audible above the sound of the wagon wheels. "To someone who doesn't ask questions that don't need answering. Someone who once helped me when I couldn't help myself, back when the whole world seemed determined to see me broken." The day crawled by with agonizing slowness, the sun hidden behind thick gray clouds that promised more snow before nightfall. They stopped only once, beside a frozen stream where Thomas helped her down from the wagon long enough to drink from his canteen and eat a handful of dried meat that tasted like leather but filled annoying emptiness in her stomach. He said nothing during their brief rest, just wrapped the blanket tighter around her shoulders when she shivered, then helped her back into the wagon with the same careful attention he might show a wounded animal. His eyes never stopped moving, scanning the tree line for any sign that they were being followed. By the time evening painted the sky the color of old blood, the forest had begun to thin, revealing glimpses of open country beyond the protective wall of pine and fir. In the distance, June could see smoke rising from a chimney, and her heart lifted with the first real hope she had felt since leaving the cabin. A small cottage sat beside a rushing river, its stone walls and steep roof looking like they had grown from the earth itself rather than been built by human hands. The building was surrounded by bare willow trees and thick brush that would provide excellent cover for anyone seeking to avoid unwanted attention. Before their wagon had even reached the gate, an old woman stepped out of the cottage as if she had been expecting them all along. She was small but unbent by age, her silver hair braided and pinned beneath a woolen shawl. Her eyes were sharp as flint, taking in every detail of their arrival with the keen intelligence of someone who had learned to read danger in the wind. "You brought the storm with you," she said to Thomas, her voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. Thomas climbed down from the wagon seat and nodded once, his respect for this woman evident in his careful posture. "The storm was already coming. I just tried to stay ahead of it." The old woman's gaze shifted to June, visible through the gap in the canvas cover, and her expression softened slightly as she took in the obvious signs of advanced pregnancy and exhaustion. "And the fire you're trying to keep burning?" she asked, but it wasn't really a question. "She's close to her time. Close enough that we need shelter and safety more than we need distance," Thomas replied. "They'll find us eventually if we keep running, but here is my land," the woman finished, And I've been dealing with men who mistake cruelty for strength longer than you've been breathing. Bring her inside. The cottage interior was warmer and more welcoming than its austere exterior suggested. Dried herbs hung from the ceiling beams in fragrant bundles, and a large kettle bubbled gently over the hearth, filling the air with the rich scent of vegetable stew. The old woman guided June to a comfortable cot beside the fire, her hands gentle but sure as she helped arrange pillows and blankets. "My name is Martha," she said, studying June's pale face and labored breathing. "I've been birthing babies and healing wounds in these mountains for more years than I care to count. You're safe here, child." June tried to speak, to express her gratitude, but Martha silenced her with a raised hand and a knowing smile. "Save your strength. That baby of yours is getting restless, and from the look of things, you're going to need every bit of energy you can muster before this night is through." As if summoned by her words, June felt another strong contraction grip her belly, stronger than any she had experienced before. Her breath caught, and her hands instinctively sought something to hold on to. As the wave of pressure built and crested before slowly receding, Martha nodded with the satisfaction of someone whose suspicions had just been confirmed. "Thomas, you'd better sharpen that axe of yours and boil some water. We're going to have company before morning, and I suspect it won't be the kind that comes bearing gifts." Outside, the wind began to howl with renewed fury, and the first fat snowflakes of the night started to fall. But inside the cottage, beside the warming fire, and under the protection of two people who had sworn to keep her safe, June felt something she hadn't experienced in months, the possibility that her child might be born into freedom. Rather than chains. The storm was coming. In more ways than one, but for the first time since this whole nightmare began, she wasn't facing it alone. Part 6. The Stand Against Darkness. The wind howled like a woman in mourning as it battered the cottage walls, driving snow against the windows with enough force to rattle the glass in its wooden frames. Inside, the fire burned bright and high, casting dancing shadows across stone walls lined with shelves of herbs, healing supplies, and the accumulated wisdom of a woman who had spent her life bringing light into dark places. June was on the narrow bed, her knees drawn up, breath coming in short, sharp gasps as another contraction built like a storm wave crashed over her and slowly receded. Sweat beaded her forehead despite the cool air, and her hands gripped the woolen blanket beneath her with white-knuckled desperation. Each pain was stronger than the last, coming faster now, with less time to recover between the waves. Martha worked with the calm efficiency of someone who had delivered dozens of babies in conditions far worse than this, her weathered hands never trembling as she prepared clean cloths, boiled water, and checked the baby's position with gentle but sure touches. She hummed softly under her breath, an old song in a language neither Thomas nor June understood, but the melody carried comfort like a lullaby passed down through generations. Thomas stood nearby, looking more uncertain than June had ever seen him. His usual confidence had been replaced by the helpless anxiety of a man who knew how to fell trees and track game, but had no idea how to help with the ancient mystery of birth. His shirt was damp with nervous sweat, and his hands opened and closed at his sides, as if searching for something useful to hold. "I don't know how to," he started to say, his voice rough with worry. Martha cut him off with a sharp look that could have stopped a charging bear. "You know how to keep trees standing in a storm, don't you? You know how to keep fire burning when the wind wants to blow it out." Thomas nodded mutely. "Then you know how to keep her steady while she brings this child into the world," Martha continued, her voice brooking no argument. "Tonight, that's all the skill you need." He knelt beside June's bed without another word of protest, and when the next contraction hit, she reached for his hand instinctively. Her fingers dug into his callous palm with surprising strength, and he didn't flinch, didn't pull away, just held steady like an anchor in a hurricane. "I'm here," he said simply, and somehow those two words carried more comfort than any elaborate speech could have provided. "That's all I know how to be." June looked into his eyes and saw not fear, but the same solid reliability she had come to depend on the steady presence of someone who had learned to endure whatever the world threw at him without breaking. "It's enough," she gasped between contractions. "You're enough." Martha continued her preparations with practiced movements, laying out clean cloths and checking the water temperature. But June could see the old woman's attention was divided. Her sharp eyes kept flicking toward the window, and her head tilted slightly as if listening for sounds that didn't belong to the natural symphony of wind and snow. The howling outside grew louder, but now it carried a different note, not just the voice of the storm, but something else mixed in. The sound of horses fighting the wind, of men shouting orders to each other, of boots crunching through deep snow with the determined pace of hunters who had found their prey's trail. Martha moved to the window and peered out through a gap in the shutters, her expression grim. "They're here," she announced matter-of-factly. 3 of them, maybe 4, armed and angry. June's body chose that moment to buckle with another massive contraction, and she cried out despite her efforts to stay quiet. The sound tore from her throat like something wild and primal, the voice of every woman who had ever brought life into a world that seemed determined to snuff it out. Thomas squeezed her hand tighter, his jaw set with fierce determination. "They can't have you," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "I won't let them." Heavy footsteps approached the cottage door, accompanied by the jingle of spurs and the creak of leather. A fist pounded against the wooden door with enough force to make the hinges groan. "We know she's in there." A rough voice shouted through the storm. "We tracked the wagon, saw the wheel marks in the snow. Send her out now, and nobody has to get hurt." Martha straightened to her full height, which wasn't particularly impressive in inches, but seemed to fill the room with authority. "This is my land," she called back, her voice carrying clearly despite the wind. "And I don't see anybody out there but wolves and weather. Don't play games with us, old woman. We got legal papers saying she belongs to her brother, and we aim to take her back where she belongs." "Legal papers," Martha snorted with contempt. "I've seen the kind of law that lets men buy and sell women like cattle. That's not law. That's just cruelty with fancy writing on it." June groaned as another contraction hit, stronger than before, and Martha quickly returned to her side. "The baby's coming fast now," she whispered. "I need you to push when I tell you, and don't worry about anything else. Let the men outside worry about men's business." The pounding on the door grew more insistent, and now June could hear multiple voices, urgent and angry. Someone was testing the shutters, looking for another way in, and she could hear the scrape of metal against wood as they probed for weaknesses. "Last chance," the leader shouted. "Send her out, or we're coming in after her." That's when Thomas stood up, his movement fluid and purposeful as a wolf rising to defend its pack. He picked up his axe from where it leaned against the wall, testing its weight in his hands like an old friend he hadn't spoken to in too long. "Martha," he said quietly, "keep working. Don't stop for anything. Where are you going?" June gasped, terror cutting through the pain of her labor. Thomas looked down at her, and in his weathered face, she saw something that took her breath away, not just determination or stubbornness, but love. Pure, fierce, protective love that would move mountains or die trying. "I'm going to remind them that some things aren't for sale," he said simply. He opened the cottage door and stepped out into the howling storm, axe in hand, shoulders squared, against both the wind and the men who waited in the darkness. Behind him, the door closed with a soft click that somehow sounded louder than thunder. Outside, June could hear voices raised in argument, then Thomas's low rumble cutting through. The noise like a blade through cloth. She couldn't make out the words over the wind and her own labored breathing, but the tone was unmistakable. The voice of a man drawing a line in the snow and daring anyone to cross it. "Push now," Martha commanded, her hand steady and sure. "Push hard and don't think about anything else. Your baby wants to be born, and by God, we're going to help her make her entrance into this world." June pushed with every ounce of strength she possessed, her body doing what women's bodies had done since the beginning of time, bringing new life into existence despite the chaos swirling around them. The pain was enormous, all-consuming, but beneath it was something else, a fierce joy, a triumphant determination that no amount of external threat could diminish. Outside, the argument had stopped, replaced by a silence more ominous than any amount of shouting. Then came a sound that made June's heart skip, the whisper of steel being drawn, the soft scrape of weapons being readied for use. But Thomas's voice carried clearly through the storm, steady and uncompromising as bedrock. "You want her? You'll have to go through me first. And I promise you, that's a journey you won't enjoy." Thunder crashed overhead. The fire flared as if responding to some unseen signal, and June pushed again with a strength she didn't know she possessed. The cottage felt simultaneously like the smallest room in the world and larger than any cathedral, filled with the ancient power of women bringing forth life while men stood guard against the darkness. The storm raged on, but inside the circle of firelight, love was winning. Part 7. The birth of hope. The wind screamed like a banshee as Thomas stepped into the swirling snow, his axe held low but ready, the familiar weight of it in his hand steadying him like an old prayer. 4 men stood in the storm, their faces hard with the kind of cruelty that came from believing money could buy anything, even human souls. Ice clung to their beards and their hands rested on gun belts, but Thomas had faced worse odds with less reason to fight. "Well, well," said the leader, a thick-set man with dead eyes and a voice like gravel. "Look what crawled out of the woodpile. You're that hermit from up the mountain, aren't you? The one who thinks he can play hero." Thomas said nothing, just stood there in the falling snow like a tree that had weathered 1,000 storms and intended to weather 1,000 more. His silence seemed to unnerve the men more than any threat could have. "Here's how this works, friend," the leader continued, his hand moving closer to his pistol. "We got legal claim to that girl in there. Her brother sold her fair and square, and we aim to collect what's ours. You step aside now, and nobody gets hurt." "Legal," Thomas repeated, his voice flat and cold as winter stone. "You call buying and selling a pregnant woman legal. You call chains and slavery legal." He raised the axe slightly, and even in the dim light, its sharp edge gleamed with deadly promise. "I call it something that ends here." One of the other men, younger and more nervous than the leader, shifted his weight from foot to foot. "Look, mister, we don't want trouble with you. This ain't your fight." Thomas's eyes never left the leader's face, but when he spoke, his words carried to all of them. "When you come to my friend's land to steal a woman and her unborn child, you make it my fight. When you threaten someone under my protection, you make it personal." Inside the cottage, June cried out again, the sound cutting through the wind like a knife. The baby was coming fast now, and Martha's voice rose in urgent command. "Push, child. Push with everything you have." The leader's hand dropped to his gun. "That's our property making all that noise in there, and we're taking her back whether you like it or—" He never finished the sentence. Thomas moved with the fluid grace of a man who had spent years learning that sometimes violence was the only language bullies understood. The axe swept up in a silver arc, not to kill but to disarm, catching the leader's gun hand with the flat of the blade and sending his pistol spinning away into the snow. The man screamed and staggered backward, clutching his broken fingers, and in that moment of chaos, something changed in the very air around them. The other men drew their weapons, but their movements seemed slow and uncertain, as if they suddenly understood they weren't dealing with some frightened hermit, but with something far more dangerous, a man with nothing left to lose, except the small light he had sworn to protect. "She's not property," Thomas said, his voice cutting through the storm with absolute authority. "She's not for sale, not for trade, not for taking. And anyone who thinks different is welcome to discuss it with this axe." The nervous young man took a step backward. "Maybe we should just—" "Shut up, Billy," the leader snarled, cradling his injured hand. "He's just one man, and there's 4 of us." But even as he spoke, doubt crept into his voice. Something in Thomas's stance, in the way he held that axe like it was part of his own body, in the absolute stillness of his weathered face, spoke of violence that would be swift, efficient, and— Final dot from inside the cottage came another cry, but this one was different, not pain but triumph, followed immediately by a sound that stopped all 4 men in their tracks. The thin, piercing wail of a newborn baby, fierce and strong and undeniably alive. Martha's voice carried through the door. "It's a girl. A beautiful, healthy girl." In that moment, something shifted in Thomas's expression. The deadly stillness remained, but beneath it burned something that made even the leader take an involuntary step backward. Not rage, but something deeper and more implacable. The protective fury of a man who had just become a father in every way that mattered. "You hear that?" Thomas asked, his voice barely above a whisper, but somehow audible over the howling wind. "That's the sound of freedom being born. That's the sound of a child who will never know chains, never know the auction block, never know what it means to be bought and sold like livestock." He took a step forward, and the men instinctively moved back. "Now you have a choice," Thomas continued, his words falling like stones into still water. "You can ride away from here and never come back, and maybe you'll live long enough to forget this night. Or you can try to take that woman and her baby, and I guarantee you'll never see another sunrise." The leader looked around at his men, seeing doubt and fear in their faces, understanding that the easy money they had been promised was about to become very expensive indeed. His broken hand throbbed, and something in the hermit's eyes promised that the hand would be the least of his worries if this went any further. "This ain't over," he said finally, but the words carried no real conviction. Thomas smiled, but there was no warmth in it. Only the cold promise of a man who had marked their faces and would remember them if they ever crossed his path again. "Yes, it is," he said simply. "It's over, and you lost. Ride away while you still can." They mounted their horses with the jerky movements of men trying to preserve dignity while fleeing for their lives. The leader looked back once as they rode into the storm, his face twisted with rage and humiliation. But he didn't stop, didn't slow down, didn't look back again. Thomas stood in the snow until their hoofbeats faded into the distance, then turned and walked back to the cottage, his axe still in his hand but no longer needed. As he reached for the door, it opened to reveal Martha, her face glowing with the satisfaction of a job well done. "Come and meet your daughter," she said simply. Inside, June lay exhausted but radiant beside the fire, cradling a small bundle wrapped in clean white cloth. The baby was perfect tiny fingers and toes, a cap of dark hair, and eyes that seemed to take in the world with ancient wisdom. She had stopped crying and was looking around with the alert curiosity of someone who had just arrived in a strange new place. Thomas approached slowly, his rough hand suddenly gentle as he touched the baby's tiny fist. She wrapped her fingers around his thumb with surprising strength, and something in his weathered face cracked open like ice in spring. "She's beautiful," he whispered, his voice thick with wonder and emotion. June looked up at him through tears of joy and exhaustion. "She's ours," she said softly. "Both of ours." She was born free because you stood between her and the darkness. Thomas knelt beside the bed, his fingers still captured by tiny hands, and nodded slowly. Outside, the storm was beginning to weaken, and the first pale hint of dawn was creeping across the sky. Inside the cottage, beside the warming fire and surrounded by love, Hope had taken human form and drawn her first breath. "What will you call her?" Martha asked, cleaning her hands on a towel. June looked at Thomas, then back at her daughter, and smiled. "Hope," she said without hesitation. "Her name is Hope." And in that moment, with the storm breaking and the sun rising, and a new life safely delivered into the world, it seemed like the most perfect name ever spoken. Part 8. The Foundation. A forever spring arrived early that year, melting the last stubborn patches of snow and coaxing green shoots from the earth with the gentle persistence of a season that understood the value of new beginnings. The cottage that had sheltered them through the winter now stood surrounded by wildflowers that Martha claimed grew better near places where important things had happened. Births, deaths, moments when the world shifted on its axis and everything changed. Thomas had spent the warming days expanding the small cabin that adjoined Martha's cottage, adding rooms with the same careful attention to detail he brought to everything he deemed worth preserving. Fresh timber, properly chinked walls, and windows positioned to catch the morning sun transformed this simple structure into something that looked less like a shelter and more like a home. June sat in the wooden rocking chair Thomas had crafted. During the long winter evenings, nursing baby Hope in the golden light that streamed through the new windows. The child was 3 months old now, healthy and strong, with her mother's dark hair and what everyone swore were Thomas's steady, watchful eyes. She had grown from the tiny, fragile thing born in the storm into a baby who gurgled with contentment and seemed to find everything around her endlessly fascinating. Thomas worked nearby, putting the finishing touches on a cradle he had been carving from a piece of cherry wood Martha had been saving for something special. This one was larger than the old pine cradle back in his abandoned cabin, designed to last through childhood and beyond. He had carved flowers along its edges, not the simple wild blooms of before, but intricate roses and lilies that spoke of something more permanent than mere survival. The sound of approaching horses made all 3 adults freeze, the hands moving instinctively toward weapons that were never far from reach. But these hoofbeats were different, slower, more measured, accompanied by the creak of wagon wheels and voices raised in what sounded like conversation rather than threat. A small procession emerged from the forest path. Judge Harrison from the territorial court, accompanied by his clerk and 2 witnesses from the nearest town. The judge was an older man with kind eyes and a reputation for fairness that had spread throughout the territory, someone who believed the law should protect the innocent rather than enable the powerful. "Mrs. Martha," he called out as he dismounted, tipping his hat with old-world courtesy. "I hope we're not intruding, but I have some business that requires official attention." Martha rose from her herb garden, brushing dirt from her hands with the calm dignity of a woman who had seen enough of life to be surprised by very little. "Judge Harrison, what brings you all this way into the mountains?" "Legal matters," he replied, removing a leather portfolio from his saddlebags. "It seems there have been some complaints filed regarding a young woman and child allegedly being held against their will in this area." June's face went pale, and she clutched Hope closer to her chest. Thomas stepped protectively between the judge and his family, his hand resting on the axe handle at his belt. Judge Harrison raised his hand in a peaceful gesture. "Now, before anyone gets excited, let me explain why I'm really here. You see, I've done some investigating into these complaints, and what I found was illuminating." He opened his portfolio and withdrew several official-looking documents. "It seems the man claiming ownership of this young woman, one Samuel Garrett, has been less than truthful about his legal standing. In fact, Mr. Garrett has outstanding warrants for cattle theft, fraud, and operating an illegal gambling establishment. Thomas's grip on his axe relaxed slightly, but his posture remained alert. Furthermore, the judge continued, after speaking with several witnesses in the town where Miss June formerly resided, I learned some disturbing facts about the circumstances surrounding her alleged sale to Mr. Garrett's associates. Witnesses report that she was held against her will, threatened with violence, and essentially sold into what can only be described as slavery. June found her voice, though it trembled with emotion. What does this mean? Judge. Harrison's expression softened as he looked at the young mother and her child. It means, miss, that any claims against your person or your child are null and void. You are a free woman, and your daughter is a free citizen of this territory, with all the rights and protections that status entails. Relief flooded through June like warm sunlight, but the judge wasn't finished. There's more, he said, withdrawing another document. It seems that Mr. Thomas here has been something of a local legend. Stories have reached town about the hermit, who saved a pregnant woman from slave traders and stood off armed men to protect her. The territorial governor has asked me to extend an offer. Thomas frowned suspiciously. What kind of offer? A deputy marshal's badge, if you want it. The territory needs men who understand that some things are worth fighting for, men who won't be bought or intimidated. The pay isn't much, but it comes with legal authority to protect folks who can't protect themselves. Thomas looked at June, then at baby Hope sleeping peacefully in her mother's arms, and slowly shook his head. I appreciate the offer, Judge, but I'm not looking to pin on a badge. I've got everything I need to protect right here. I thought you might say that. Judge Harrison smiled. Which brings me to my final piece of business. He withdrew one last document, this one bearing official seals and ribbons. By the authority vested in me by the territorial government, I'm authorized to perform marriages. I'm told there might be a couple here who could benefit from such a service. June looked up at Thomas with eyes bright with sudden tears. They had never spoken of marriage explicitly, had never made formal declarations or promises, but in the months since Hope's birth, they had built something together that felt more solid and permanent than any legal document. Well, Thomas asked quietly, kneeling beside the rocking chair. What do you think, June? Want to make this official? She reached out and took his calloused hand in hers, feeling the strength and steadiness that had been her anchor through the darkest times of her life. I think, she said softly, that Hope deserves parents who are bound together by more than just circumstance. The ceremony was simple, conducted in Martha's garden with the wildflowers as witnesses and baby Hope gurgling happily in her mother's arms. Thomas spoke his vows in the same quiet, certain voice he used for everything that mattered. Promises to protect, to provide, to stand between his family and whatever darkness the world might offer. June's vows were spoken through, tears of joy promises. To trust, to love, to build something beautiful from the ashes of what they had both lost. When Judge Harrison pronounced them husband and wife, Thomas kissed her gently, carefully, as if she were made of something precious that might break if handled roughly. As the small wedding party shared Martha's elderberry wine and celebrated the newest family in the territory, June found herself thinking about the night Hope was born, about the storm that had brought them all together, about the chain of events that had led from slavery and desperation to this moment of perfect contentment. What are you thinking about? Thomas asked, settling beside her on the porch step with Hope, sleeping peacefully in his arms. June leaned against his solid shoulder and watched the sun set behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and rose. I'm thinking about fires, she said softly, about how sometimes the coldest, darkest nights are when the brightest flames are born. Thomas nodded, understanding without need for explanation. The fire he had lit that first night when he found her dying in the snow had never gone out. It had simply grown, spreading from one small cabin to encompass something larger, a family, a home, a future built on the simple but profound truth that some things in this world were worth protecting at any cost. Baby Hope stirred in his arms and opened her eyes, looking up at her father with the trusting gaze of someone who had never known fear, never known want, never known anything but love and safety. In those dark eyes, Thomas saw not just his daughter's future, but the promise that the light they had kindled together would continue to burn long after they were gone, passed down through generations like the most precious inheritance of all. Outside, the wind picked up, rustling the leaves and carrying the scent of pine and wildflowers. But inside their small circle of love, surrounded by the solid walls Thomas had built and warmed by the fire that had saved them all, the newest family in the territory settled into the peaceful rhythm of an evening that felt like the beginning of forever. The storm had passed, the darkness had been defeated, and hope, in all its forms, had found a home in the mountains of Montana, where it would grow and flourish for all the years to come.